inquiry that's been announced. The issue is, what in fact should we do in Canada to legitimately pursue war criminals, but at the same time, can we avoid what some people feel to be the excesses that took place in the United States? So the purpose then is both to inform and at the same time to learn from the experience of others, especially from our colleagues in the United States, about the topic of investigating war criminals today.
The Germans invaded the USSR on June 22nd, 1941. In the face of the German advance, Stalin's strategic plan, so-called, was put into effect. Cities, factories, and food supplies were blown up. Tens of thousands of prisoners in the hands of the NKVD, the secret police, were executed.
I'd like to submit that the public at large tends to have a romantic, exotic, and a folksy image of Russia, an emotional image that tends to exclude and is impervious to such horrible facts as the murder of some 23 million civilians in the USSR, one for every year of Stalin's regime.
As the Soviets left, Ukrainians came to these prisons to find their relatives, and they found these horrendous mounds of massacred people who were massacred not only in the traditional way of the shot in the back of the head, but there were almost every case in every city indications of the most sadistic dismemberments and other kinds of tortures carried out. And it would be the relatives of many of these people who were massacred in the last moments of the Soviet retreat who would, of course, volunteer for various military units to fight the Soviets and the Soviets alone.
The collaboration which the Ukrainian nationalists were prepared to engage in with the Germans hinged upon German recognition of Ukrainian independence. When the Germans made it clear in 1941 that they were not prepared to accept that condition, the Ukrainian nationalists turned against the Germans, and they were the ones, of course, who organized the Ukrainian insurgent army, which fought both the Germans and the Soviets. Almost 45% of all collective and state farm cattle were driven across the border to Russia. Over 50,000 factories and plants were dismantled and removed. As early as November 1941, Germans held 3.6 million prisoners of war, among whom were an estimated 1.3 million Ukrainians.
That Ukrainians participated in World War II in large numbers, on all fronts, and in various uniforms. This is not surprising. World War II's fiercest battles were fought on their territory.
Unlike in most countries occupied by the Nazis, in Ukraine and Poland, assisting Jews was punishable by death, and hundreds in Ukraine were executed for such actions.
The relationships between the Jews and the Ukrainians were never free of outside interference. There was always a third factor, a dominant power which exercised a decisive influence. In the 20th century, the Ukrainian-Jewish relations stood, I would say, in the shadow of communist Russia and Nazi Germany.
Göring thought that the best thing would be to kill all men in Ukraine over 15 years of age. Himmler advocated that the entire Ukrainian intelligentsia must be decimated. Erich Koch declared, "If I find a Ukrainian who is worthy of sitting at the same table with me, I must have him shot." Since the nationalist leaders refused to collaborate with the Germans or to withdraw their demand for German recognition of Ukrainian independence, Bandera and Stetsko spent the war in German concentration camps. Melnik was kept under house arrest. He himself was also sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1944. By 1944, when the German armies were cleared from Soviet Ukrainian soil, the Republic was literally in ruins. More than 700 cities and towns were destroyed, 42% of all urban centers devastated by the war in the entire USSR, and over 28,000 villages were destroyed.
Slavs were Untermenschen, who were to be exploited and then eliminated. Some 1.5 million Ukrainians were shipped to Germany as slave laborers during the war, and an additional 3.9 million Ukrainians, including 0.9 million Jews, were civilian victims of the Nazi Holocaust.
The Second World War, reported Edgar Snow during his travels in Ukraine in 1945, and I quote, "No single European country suffered deeper wounds to its cities, its industries, its farmlands, and its humanity," end quote.
It is important, then, to differentiate among collaborators. The very reason I chose the word pawns for the title of my study of Soviet displacement and repatriation in World War II was to emphasize the plight of so many who had scarcely an option or a prayer caught between the likes of Hitler and Stalin.
But because the Ukrainian underground, the UPA, fought on two fronts, against the Nazis and against the Soviets, it became a target for Soviet disinformation and covert action.
That some Ukrainians and Balts collaborated with Germany is undeniable, but their numbers were significantly smaller than those of the Italians, who collaborated with Hitler all through the war, the Soviets, who actively collaborated with Hitler between 1939 and 1941, the Vichy Frenchmen, who willingly placed their entire government under Nazi rule and provided human and material resources to the German war effort, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Norwegians, and the Danes, all of whom had enthusiastic fascist parties both before and during the Nazi occupation.
The significant proportion of whom were Eastern Ukrainians were sent back forcibly to the Soviet Union. But at least 250,000, and perhaps even more, were left in Western Europe. The question then becomes, what do we do with them?
The most important regular unit, which was organized in mid-1943, was the Division Hrycenko, or the 14th Grenadier Division of the Waffen-SS. The formation of this unit was surrounded with a great deal of controversy. The Ukrainian underground circles were strongly opposed to its formation in the beginning, but once it became a fait accompli, they used it to train their own people. Later on, these trainees deserted and rejoined the underground. Also, a large number of men joined the underground after the division was destroyed at the Battle of Brody in 1944. The remnants, I should say, were formed into another division, which became the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army. It is this unit that creates controversy to this day in Canada. At the end of the war, even the Soviets were not able to come up with any specific charges against this division.
There is, however, no credible evidence that the division was used at any time against the civilian population of any nationality.
Collaboration with the enemy, serving in the German armed forces or for the German armed forces, is not in itself a war crime or a crime against humanity. It is only if there is murder of innocent civilians or prisoners of war, if we get involved in the crime of murder, that we're talking about war crimes or crimes against humanity.
It is a matter of record that every applicant under the Displaced Persons Act was checked by the FBI, the Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army, which included, by the way, 21 separate investigative steps, the OSS, the Provost Marshal General of the U.S. Army in Germany, the Berlin Document Center, the Fingerprint Center in Heidelberg, various consular officers, especially assigned to the DP program, the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the Department of Justice stationed overseas, and special U.S. investigators assigned to screen escapees from communist countries.
That in this Rimini internment period, the members of the Divizia were repeatedly screened, not only by the British, with the assistance of Ukrainian Canadians like Panchuk, and the Americans, but also by the Soviets. No evidence of any wrongdoing was discovered. The outcry about alleged Ukrainians as war criminals in Canada has been orchestrated to make it appear as if somehow these men of the division, and it's usually the division that's targeted, came in a dubious manner. It makes you wonder why the issue is sporadically brought up. The Foreign Office found nothing wrong, the High Commissioner for Canada found nothing wrong, the RCMP found nothing wrong, the Americans found nothing wrong, the Soviets couldn't prove anything, the CJC was effectively able to defer Cabinet's decision, but it could produce no evidence. So finally, on September 25th, 1950, the Canadian Cabinet canceled its deferment order, and the immigration of members of this division to Canada was allowed. Several hundred, perhaps even a few thousand, eventually did resettle here.
The most vociferous opponents of the DP Act were America's communists, who were among the first to indiscriminately label all refugees from communist terror as, quote, Nazi collaborators. The current defamation campaign is the tip of the iceberg. It's an iceberg that began in 1933, when the United States first recognized the USSR, and this was, as you may recall, during the height of the famine. The enemy is the Soviet Union and disinformation.
Unless we have the ability and the willpower to take a stand and show that this is disinformation, the Ukrainian diaspora, if you will, has to respond to this type of attack on every point immediately and factually.
There has been a shift. War criminals, Nazi war criminals, SS, Ukrainians, and so on, and it sort of, after a while, appeared that Ukrainians were being singled out. And the image of the Ukrainian community that was suffering from it. We have to react to the media, we have to react to the press, television, we have to react to radio reports, and we also have to establish a good dialogue with the Jewish community. One of the best forums for this is the Canadian Council of Christians and Jews. There's need in the Ukrainian community for Ukrainian affirmative action.
We all want to see Nazi war criminals prosecuted to the full extent of the law. What we don't want is a witch hunt. We don't want a McCarthy-like phenomenon in Canada.
After all, the prosecution of a war criminal is not a prosecution of the people to which he belongs. It is a prosecution of the individual alone. Nazi war criminals in Canada should be brought to justice, as should all war criminals and all criminals against humanity.
All the archives, all the material in the archives belong and are controlled by the KGB. The witnesses that they produce for depositions are in complete and sole protection and custody of the KGB, and they control their testimony from the beginning to end. It is very important for KGB to demoralize its dissidents, refuseniks, the people who are against the system, the Soviet court system, and their investigators, the KGB, are simply corrupt. They are totally unacceptable to Americans and to Canadians. Now we have a cancer. You just have a cold.
I'd like to say, perhaps in conclusion, that this was a very modest but sincere effort on the part of many individuals, and we hope that in fact you have shared with us information and also a new perspective on what should be done in Canada, based on experience in the United States and based also on the facts that we've heard all day. I'd like to thank all the speakers who at very short notice, within 2 weeks, agreed to drop almost everything to give us some help in trying to decide on which way forward in this whole situation.